welcome back to Martins and More. My name's Maury Rutch.
And I'm Spoon Phillips.
And we have some really cool things to talk about today. What's going on, Spoon?
Well, it's interesting. I've been playing a lot of guitar again for the first time in a while, really going at it and realized just how rusty I was, especially when it comes to my fingerstyle pieces that I composed. How about you?
I didn't want to say anything, but I've always been a fan of fingerstyle guitar, and it's one of those things where I listen to so many radio stations on Pandora. When I say radio stations, of course, I mean the ones I'm in charge of. I don't listen to the radio anymore, but we certainly like to get a pretty good mix of music around here. If I go upstairs, it's Grateful Dead 25 hours a day, 8 days a week. But when I come down into the studio and I'm not on the phones, I do like to listen to a lot of music. And maybe today is a good day to talk about that kind of music which does not have vocals. Would you call that fingerstyle?
Well, I call it instrumental music. And of course, some of my favorite Grateful Dead is their instrumental jam session. So there's a shout out to Brother Andrew out there in Pennsylvania, who's, if you don't know, is the reason Maury has to listen to Grateful Dead all day long. But
I'll read into that comment the way I want to, which means you don't like the Grateful Dead when they sing.
No, that's not true at all. But I mean, what really got me into them as a kid, in addition to some of their acoustic stuff, like on Working Man's Dead, was their extended, freeform jazz stuff. But anyway, yeah. So instrumental music. So I think today we've decided we're gonna discuss some of our favorite fingerstyle albums, like solo acoustic guitar fingerstyle albums. They don't necessarily have to be all instrumental. Fingerstyle meaning, of course, finger picking. But there's a difference between, in some people's minds, finger picking means you're finger picking, like Travis picking that was based on the style that Merle Travis had pioneered. That's usually associated with singing, like Paul Simon, people like that, as opposed to fingerstyle, where you're playing melody and bass parts with the hand and often without any vocals involved at all.
Very good point. I appreciate that distinction. And if you're no stranger to the podcast, you have heard recently we've been getting into some really fun top 10 lists. Today's not going to be a top 10. We're not going to rate anybody. If we're going to mention somebody at the early part of the show, it doesn't mean they're going to be better than people at the end of the show. We're just going to sit here and spend a little bit of time telling you some of our favorite fingerstyle CDs. And Spoon, I'm going to be a gentleman and let you go first.
Well, I'm going to defer to the second half because I have a question for you, is getting you totally off guard. Do you remember any, could be vocals or not, early track on an album that was very impressive to you because of the finger picking or fingerstyle guitar? Anything strike you as being, very early influential on, I like that, I want to listen to more music like that?
Ooh, off guard I am. Let me think about that for a second. A really inspirational instrumental piece that begins an album or begins a song that just grabbed me and didn't let go?
No, just a song. Like I'll go first, but to give you time to think about it. When I was quite young, my brother used to borrow record albums from friends all the time, and he borrowed one that had an amazing guitar piece on it that sounded like two people playing, and sounded really unlike anything I'd heard before. And it turned out to be Bach's Beret, which is a very famous fingerstyle piece that a lot of people, classical guitar piece that a lot of people learned, particularly back in that era. And it was from an early Leo Kottke album called Mudlark. And it really blew me away. And it's the only tune remotely like it on the record. It's one of his Leo Kottke's records where he has like bass and drum accompaniment and is mainly singing and stuff like that. So it really blew me away and made me, then I started to, really hear that more. And then I realized that was the sort of thing that Paul Simon was doing. Of course, he was famous for doing that instrumental Angie that he didn't write, but he certainly helped popularize it. And then Stephen Stills, people like that. That's where I really got hooked into, finger pickers and fingerstyle playing. Does that give you enough time to think of something?
No, I was listening to what you were saying. I can't think and listen at the same time. But that's interesting. And you saying that does really bring me back to what I could have said. Guinevere from David Crosby. And maybe not even as much as listening to live versions or the recorded versions, but friends of ours at Martin Fest. And I won't have to tell you too many times to remind you that our friend Mark from the West Coast, back when Martin Fest was in full gear, maybe 6-7 years ago, when it seemed like year after year nobody missed that. He would often bring his D45 out, and it's just the unusual nature of the tuning, and it's a combination of the song is so old and so great, and then when you see somebody do it in the tuning it belongs in, it was probably that song is a really good answer to your off-the-cuff question. I only wish we had weeks and weeks between episodes where you could tell me what you're going to ask me. I could have been a little bit more prepared.
But no, that's a great answer. I could have cited that as well as something that, when I was younger, that really impressed me. And this is Martins and More after all. So I'd like to point out for those people who don't know that Marcus was such a David Crosby fan and is such a David Crosby fan that he actually bought a 1968/69 D45 when they first brought them out, and Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young all bought one. We're talking about the straight-braced European spruce top Brazilian rosewood D45 that he would let everybody play. He wouldn't bring it every year. He also had a Stephen Stills signature model. He would bring that sometimes. But yeah, to listen to him play Guinevere on that was always a great treat. And my just butchering trying to sing the harmony on it, but was something you always did very well. So I'll just take it one more step forward toward Leo Kottke, because then I went out and bought, not even knowing what it was. I just saw there's a Leo Kottke album, and I remembered that other album, and it's the album My Feet Are Smiling, which was at least the first live album that I ever heard. And just spectacular fingerstyle playing on 12-string and 6-string. And he does like one, vocal song on it, that old song Louise that, he covered regularly and played slide on. But just blew me away. And a particular song called Stealing, that he called it Stealing because it was a bastardization of the famous picking song Doc's Guitar. That was referring to Doc Watson. But he did it, Leo Kottke originally came up with the tune because he wanted to write a harmony part for it. He wanted to come up with a harmony for that tune, and then it turned into this song called Stealing. And if people know both songs, you can certainly easily recognize the influence. But anyway, that's a marvelous tune that I keep thinking someday I'm going to master, but haven't. So I'm going to spring another one on you. When did you start fingerpicking?
Well, probably 1987, 88 maybe. I want to say it was definitely before 1990, but right around 84, 85, I started playing electric guitar, and it was a little while until I got into acoustic. But it's safe to say, as soon as I did gravitate towards acoustic, it was acoustic fingerstyle that I liked best. I basically graduated from strumming and playing guitar on electric guitar. As soon as I found what I liked about the acoustic, it was the fingerstyle nature of it, I think, that I gravitated to first. Not that I could do it very quickly, properly, but right around the same time as I discovered acoustic guitar, that's why I wanted one. It wasn't a love for strumming or flat picking or bluegrass. It was acoustic stuff. And you'd mentioned Paul Simon a few minutes ago. On a previous podcast, I mentioned the concert in Central Park was extremely influential to me. So anything Simon and Garfunkel were doing, that was probably, what was that concert, 81, 82?
That sounds right in there. Yep.
His and Martins and More. You talked about the Martins, I'll talk about the More. That was an Ovation guitar, at least in that concert. So ironically, it was a while before I loved Martin guitars. I just loved acoustic guitars and acoustic finger picking. And at the very, very onset, ironically, it was Ovation guitars that I was at least looking at, not necessarily recognizing my love for Martins exactly at that time. But Paul Simon stuff, as soon as I latched onto that, I went back, and I probably didn't buy everything he had in order, but I certainly discovered Simon and Garfunkel from that concert and quickly went back and found all I could with maybe not the earliest folkiest stuff that they did, but I'm a huge fan of all the stuff that was on the Bridge Over Troubled Water era, and I've could babble and you'd stop me after an hour. I'd still be talking about Paul Simon, but he's so influential. And James Taylor's another one, but Paul Simon's probably the guy.
Yeah, and he makes everything seem so effortless, and just like like it's water just flowing downstream. So yeah, so tell me about one of your favorite fingerstyle albums.
Well, I can't start this program without really going to the heart of it. I really do think it's fair to say Howard Emerson's Crossing Crystal Lake is at least at the forefront in my mind. It's not necessarily, like we said, we're not going to rate this list, but I really have to talk about that CD. And as we go through this conversation, it's going to be funny. I think many of the things I'm really drawn to happened right around 2004. So 2004, for whatever silly reason, was a really watershed year for me and the music that I like, that I'm calling fingerstyle. But if you can go and find Crossing Crystal Lake from Howard Emerson, the way I would describe Howard's technique and Howard's playing, it's so rhythmic and he's like a metronome. And I know there's a lot of people we're going to talk about on these lists, and maybe you and I would agree. Some players have a lot of flash, and almost at the cost of, it's not necessarily super perfect timing, but there's a rhythmic quality to Howard Emerson. I don't know if he would agree with this or if he would like me saying it, but I suspect he's actually more interested in driving the beat and the syncopation and keeping things in time as much as any other quality of his music. The phrasing, the melody, and the counter bass. He's doing everything that you want to hear on a fingerstyle album, but for some reason, and I don't know why, but his stuff resonates with me so much. It's just like a clock. And I don't know if you do this when you're traveling, but when you're going back and forth in Pennsylvania, oftentimes you'll go through some tunnels, and it's that old trick where the radio's playing, or like I said earlier, Pandora, and the signal goes away for a minute because you can't, get the antenna. And as you're humming along with the song, when the signal goes away and it comes back about a minute later, you're clearly not still on the beat. You've lost it. I bet Howard Emerson has never lost a beat playing guitar in his lifetime. It just feels like he has such an internal drummer with him. And when I say that, I don't mean he's lacking in any respect when it comes to the other parts of what builds a really good fingerstyle composition. But his rhythm, it knocks me over. Of course, he has more CDs than that, and I've got a couple of them in my collection. But that CD itself probably means a lot to me, not just because I love the sound of it, but back in 2004, I was really lucky enough to have Howard Emerson come to Maury's Music for one of our anniversary parties. And before the show, he's sitting on our stage and he's noodling away at this is new music for him at the time because that CD was just coming out. He actually took some time to show me some of the chops, and I didn't really latch on to it like I should have, and I didn't put the time into it to say that I could play it for you now. But hearing that album and hearing Howard Emerson play it for me and having Howard try to teach me, that's one of my big ones, Crossing Crystal Lake from Howard Emerson.
For a lot of us, it's a seminal album, and I think because now I first met Howie when he was actually working in the acoustic guitar room at Sam Ash on 48th Street. But a lot of people who are not familiar with Howard Emerson, he lives out on Long Island. You can go to howardemerson.com. He was in Billy Joel's original band and toured with Billy Joel. He does the classical guitar on like early Billy Joel recordings and stuff like that. And so he's a trained classical musician for all intents and purposes. So yes, you call it, his tempo, his timing. He has the timing of a full-fledged top house, professional guitarist and professional, musician, studio musician. But I think the word that you will miss throughout all that is groove. It's Howie's groove.
Yes.
That is what it is all about. And he loves traditional fingerstyle blues, and he's a very deft slide player. He's he does some he'll branch off into stuff that sounds more Latin and things like that. But I can't recommend his music enough. And I saw him years later at the guitar show out on Long Island. And by this time he had become a Martin clinician, and he was at the Martin booth, and hanging out. It was the first time I'd really seen him in a long time. We got talking, and Martin had given him an OM-18V, and I owned an OM-18V at that time. And we got talking again, got reacquainted. his wife had talked him into starting to use artificial fingernails, the kind you get done in beauty parlors. And so I started doing them too, because that's what you do when you get older and your nails get thinner and thinner. And I only recently saw him playing a video the other night where he's no longer doing that, and he's actually using some sort of unusual looking finger picks on his first two fingers. But so I'm going to reach out to him about that. But anyway, yes, I have all of his CDs. Crossing Crystal Lake is the seminal album, but I would recommend people check out any of them. He used to also do video lessons. I don't know if he still does that. Lately, and on Crossing Crystal Lake, one of the things I liked about it is he mentions what guitars he's playing. So on some guitars, he's playing a vintage L00 Gibson. On some guitars, he's playing a 1954 0018, which is his main Martin, but he really wanted the wider string, so that's when he switched to the OM-18V. These days, he plays guitars built by his very long-time friend, John Montileone. So he's got flat tops and arch tops. He plays arch tops. He's got an old Gibson L5. Very cool guy. Howard Emerson. Howie and I go back, but I haven't seen him in a long time because of the pandemic. And you talked about my one quick Howard story before we move on from this is the very first Martin Fest, he was one of the musical guests. He was our musical guest, and he came and he did a set out at the park in a 98 to 100 degree weather. And he's sitting there playing and mesmerizing everybody. And these young guys were walking across the parking lot, and one of them started clapping his hands, like to the rhythm or whatever. And Howard just said, and they're laughing, and Howard just said, tempo, tempo, and didn't, of course, didn't miss a beat, but because that other guy certainly did. But anyway, yeah, Howard Emerson. We can't recommend Howie enough. Howie, if you ever hear of this, I do love your most recent album. I really haven't talked to you about it, but we'll catch up. And when it comes to players that are super good, but not that well known, but in certain circles they are, I want to give a shout out to Teja Gherkin. Acoustic guitar players will know him. He was with Acoustic Guitar Magazine for years, did their video reviews for years. Now he does his own thing. But he's got CDs out, but his original CD I really enjoyed, and it's still in my playlist. I think a lot of these albums I'm mentioning, I like cherry pick tunes that I really like. And so a couple of his tunes, I have a couple of Larry Pattis tunes from his CDs that are in my regular rotation on my phone. One of them called The Paths of Swannanoa is quite beautiful. And then, of course, Al McMean, who I know you know.
Oh, yeah, Al McMean's a great friend, and I probably know Al just a little bit longer than I know Howard Emerson, and this part of my story might sound exactly the same as my Howard Emerson crush. Bear with me if it sounds like I'm reading from a script, but I can say the same things about Al McMean. Probably one of his most influential albums to me is Dancing the Strings, but if I'm being honest, I probably found 3 of his CDs at the same time. Another one's called Breakout. And this time of year, I'm not sure if this podcast is going to air in time, but you simply must find The Soul of Christmas from Al McMean. That's exactly what you should be listening to all December long. My sincere apologies if this airs in January, but still put it on because it's still great. But Al McMean, another good friend, he's actually been to the store many, many times. Going back 10 years ago, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for Al to call me up every month. He'd either buy another guitar from us, or he found a guitar and wanted to buy another pickup from us. But he'd make it a pretty fun routine to drive up to the store, spend the afternoon, and I would install a K&K pickup for him pretty often. And it wouldn't be without him sitting on the couch and just playing the stuff he plays. And man, when I look back to the way things were in 2004, 2005, to just have a regular afternoon day at a music store would be broken up by somebody like him coming in and just pulling one of the dozens of Martins off the wall and just chatting like we are now, but in between talking, you would just hear this live music from somebody like him. And again, really, really rhythmic, really understated. I mean, I know there are some people that might get on this list before it's over that could just go crazy insane in what they can do with an instrument. And I think Howard and Al McMean can, but don't. And when I say that, I mean it as a compliment. They're kind of letting the things happen in music where it's the notes you don't play kind of thing. But Howard, being the groove master, if we want to call him that, El McMean, I would categorize him a little bit more melody driven. And some of the things he did that really knocked me over, a lot of great original compositions for sure, but stop me if you remember this, but you might recognize he did a really cool version of Tears of a Clown, killer version of a Frankie Valli tune. I forget the name of it now, but they're both on the same album. But some really neat Motown-driven things and melodies that you sort of associate with anything but fingerstyle guitar. And he was a big fan of the OM-size instruments. I know he has a lot of different guitars now, as everybody else on this list probably does. But the El McMean that I remember would have been playing something like an OM-18V or a lot of different Rosewoods. He might have had a Philly Folk Festival model at one time. But big on capoing in the 2nd fret or the 4th fret. And maybe not as rhythm heavy as Howard, but certainly enough groove to go along with anything else. And his CD called Dancing the Strings, I think, would be the second one that I want to mention. And before we go further, I should take this time to say, whether you're listening in the car or watching on YouTube, we're going to do our best to put all these artists in the show notes. So if you like what we're saying, if we're going to name somebody who pops up your antenna and you want to go learn more about them, we're going to point you towards all the good stuff in the comments and in the show notes on Apple Music.
And also, we are very interested, particularly those on YouTube who can put comments in hearing the fingerstyle artists that you like. We have not mentioned a lot of the more traditional sort of country southern fingerpickers, though we may get to that if we have time. One thing I want to point out about El, where Howard Emerson is very blues-oriented, El comes from the Celtic tradition and plays the Celtic C tuning, which is very similar to Dadgad, except that you drop the low E to C and you drop the A to G. And he basically plays that 100% of the time, which gives his compositions really interesting sound and gravitas to have that lower C note when you want it. And like Howie, they both cross-tune. Howie's real big on cross-tuning. That means like you're going to play, let's say you're going to tune your guitar to open G, but then you put the capo someplace so it's really an open B, but then he composes in F sharp major or something like that. And El, in addition to doing those cool Motown songs and his own compositions, he has entire albums of like Irish fiddle tunes and the old Carolyn tunes and that kind of stuff. And he usually always has at least one or two old traditional, really would have been a Scottish or Irish or British fiddle tune, and that he has, or even a pipe tune that he has composed into transposed for the guitar. So I like the Breakout album a lot. His song he wrote for his wife, Song for Sheila, is just a real, really gets my heartstrings and is really quite evocative and really wonderful. Like you talked about, it's rather slow and has a lot of air in it or sustained notes and stuff. And then this, relatively simple chorus, if you want to call it a chorus. It's not with vocals, but just really lovely. And so good on them. I really enjoyed seeing him and Larry Pattis do a show together at a church in New Jersey years ago. And the review I wrote for the various guitar forums and stuff in the old days might still be out there on the interwebs, as my friend Bill calls them. But so yeah, those are people that aren't that well known, and there's zillions of people who are not that well known. So we're definitely interested in hearing some of your favorite fingerstylists, whether they're American or over in Europe or wherever. So please put them in the comments. But to go to one of the biggies, I've got to make a shout out to Michael Hedges' record, Aerial Boundaries. A friend of mine that I'd gone to high school with when I was in college just gave me a cassette. And I think it had like a Neil Young album on one side, like the most recent Neil Young album, and then this Michael Hedges album. I was unfamiliar with him at the time and just really blew me away. A lot of people will remember the Windham Hill label and that had like pianist George Winston on it, but I'm pretty sure Michael Hedges was on Windham Hill. I might be getting it mixed up with another one of those indie labels that did solo instrumental music people. It was a long time ago, but boy, did that just wow me. And he was actually like a huge Crosdale's Nash and Young fan. And the story goes that he showed up at the famous place in Berkeley that has the famous open mic and auditioned and played like a Neil Young song and sang it. And the guy was like, yeah, whatever, you can show up. And then he showed up and started doing, he's one of those pioneers of the slap, maybe not a pioneer, but masters of the slap technique on the neck and all that stuff. And he actually approached David Crosby and Graham Nash in a parking lot. Said, can I play something? Can I play something? Can I play something? And he did, and just blew him away. And so David Crosby became an immediate Michael Hedges fan, and they, were pals, and they both sing on they sing My Country 'Tis of Thee on an album that has Michael doing the guitar. But yeah, and poor Michael, he died tragically many years ago now in a car accident on his car had gone off like a mountain road in Northern California, and they didn't find him for some days or something like that. But it was very sad. It was a really tragic loss to the music world. So Michael Hedges, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he influenced a zillion young guitar players that got into the body slapping and neck slapping and that kind of percussive techniques that are so popular that Martin came out with that special bridge plate sensor, as part of their Aura setup for people who like to do that kind of music. So it gives you some idea of how popular it is out there in the world.
Can I take this quick opportunity to embarrass myself a little bit?
Please.
I saw Crosby, Stills and Nash maybe in the mid-'90s, early 90s, and Michael Hedges opened up. And I had no idea who he was, and I was bored. I'm like so mad at my past self for feeling that way. You go through life, and then as you finally, your musical taste change. Like, you know what? I think I saw that guy, and of course you see set lists on the internet now, and I don't know how many shows he actually went with them on tour, but I had the opportunity, and I was there, and I didn't enjoy it. And I was all ripe for like, come on, three-part harmony. What's this? There's not even, this is like, nah, get this out of the way. Of course, if I can go back now and appreciate it better.
Yes, of course. But we were all like that. I mean, we all, were bored with opening acts that went on, and later on we felt that way. I mean, my very first concert I ever saw as a kid was the Guess Who in a reunion tour, and there was an unknown guy from my area that opened for them named Bob Seger. So, yeah, and I did not go see the next concert for some reason, because my parents wouldn't let me. This is in my hometown, by the way, in our little ice rink, and the opening act was David Lindley and Jackson Browne. But I didn't even know that at the time until I found out after the fact. But,
You fool.
Well, it was my fault. I wasn't allowed to go. I don't remember who the headliner was now. But it was like a chick, a young girl's heartthrob kind of artist. So I was not really interested in going anyway, but I had no idea who the opening act would have been. And I had to go back to start my final tour. In fact, my final term at school. In fact, I had to go back and cast what had become my thesis project show. And my sister was going to buy me as an early birthday present seeing Michael Hedges and Leo Kottke at Town Hall. And I already had my plane tickets. So I couldn't do that. But there's a couple videos of it out there, and particularly the encore where they play together, and Michael is playing a vintage 518 Martin Tourist guitar as they jam together on some, kind of really spacey fingerstyle piece. And we talked about Howie's blues stuff and talked about El's Celtic influence. Michael Hedges is very trance-like and very repetitive patterns building and that kind of stuff. So I find some of his stuff just perfect for if you have to take, an Epsom salt bath after a tough football game, as I used to do in the old days, and sit there and just soak and listen to, you would make mixtapes of just his sort of relaxation, meditation kind of stuff. So those guys were real big. Around the same time, I rediscovered Leo Kottke because he had gotten into being overproduced, kind of the way that Jim Croce and Townes Van Zandt got overproduced with too much percussion and stuff, and I found it kind of boring. And so But then he had a tune in one of the guitar magazines from his new album called My Father's Face. So I got the album so I could learn to play the song, and really loved the album. And it does have other instrumentation on it, but very tastefully done, as well as having some solo pieces. But of course, as I've found many times throughout my life, if I hear an album from an artist I'm not familiar with, or I normally wouldn't like that much, and I really, really like the album, like almost every time it was produced by T-Bone Burnett. And so I highly recommend Leo Kottke's album, My Father's Face. It came out maybe 1990. He had just switched to start playing Taylor's. Bob Taylor had built him a 12-string that really brought him back to the 12-string. And but it has a bunch of other, like, fretless bass on it and stuff here and there, but just very interesting, very tasteful, typical of T-Bone Burnett. An accordion will come in out of the blue just at exactly the right place. Those kind of techniques, and very subtle and very cool and well done. So a big shout out to that. They really brought me back to Leo Kottke, who I've really kind of stayed with ever after. So what's another artist that you like, or an album that you would recommend for his fingerstyle fans?
If you think you're the only person who's going to talk about acoustic guitar magazine people on this podcast, you are mistaken. I will see your Taya Gherkin and raise you Doug Young.
Ooh, very good call.
If you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, I dare you to pause this program, do a search for acoustic pickups, and see if you can find anything that's not attached to Doug Young. Doug Young, at least in my short lifetime, is the person who knows and cares and shares about acoustic guitar pickups. He's famous for having his website full of pickup guitar samples, and chances are, if any company ever makes a guitar pickup and makes it public, Doug Young tried it, recorded it, did a blog about it, played it at a gig. It's Doug Young seems to just be living for acoustic guitar pickups, what makes them good, what makes them bad. Kidding aside, if you try to figure out and research something about a modern acoustic guitar pickup or microphone post 1995, you're going to find something about Doug Young somewhere, because he's tried it, and he's probably the one that knows more about it than you. But back in 2020, I got a really good CD. It's called Duets, and it's Doug Young and Taya Gherkin.
And Taya Gherkin, I was just going to bring it up. Yeah, exactly, yes.
Boy, is that good. And I remember listening to that mostly. You know how a lot of music can be the soundtrack from some event in your life. We took a trip to Cape Cod or Salem up in Massachusetts, and that, I don't know if she admitted it or not, but Lori got so sick of me spinning that, because it's 8 hours home if you don't hit traffic. And I just, it's one of those things, and this isn't it doesn't poke fun at fingerstyle, but when you're listening to something like that, if you go past the last track and it repeats, you don't always immediately notice, and you don't want to change it. It's just such a great vibe. I would use the word relaxed when I describe how that album comes across, and when I say that, what I really mean is it doesn't feel like anybody's fighting anything. There's two guitar players, obviously, and they're complementary. It's not somebody's playing rhythm and being bored and somebody's showing off and playing too much lead. It really sounds like almost as if you could get two people to play one instrument, and if there was enough room on the fretboard for both fingerstyle hands to be doing both parts, it seems very, very, very unified. And they're I don't know if they've done a lot more since then. I know they have really big catalogs and resumes alone, but that album they did together, I do speak from a point of view where I don't know a lot about them on their own.
Yeah, quite agree. And it's for sale. You can get it. You just go to tayagherkin.com. You can get it. I'm sure you can find it on Doug's stuff as well. Very good. Very cool. Yeah, very good call. Very good call. I'm glad you brought that up. There's an awful lot of Chet heads out there, as they call themselves. There's a huge following of Chet Atkins, and who made it all look very easy, and and could get very country or not that country. But of course, his influences go back to, they call it Travis picking for a reason. And Merle Travis, for people who are not that familiar with Merle Travis's work, he's one of those guys that wore those extremely spangly outfits and looked really country and had sideburns and all that. But what a guitar player! Often played a big hollow body electric with a whammy bar, but to hear him play acoustic guitar was always a great treat. True Travis picking, he literally only played with his first finger. He almost never used another finger other than he used his thumb and his first finger, where everybody else tends to use at least two fingers, if not three, and sometimes four. But I'll just throw out a quick album for people to check out if you're not familiar. Is Live in Boston, which was something that was released in modern times. And it's just him solo with his D28 and with the Bigsby neck on it, because he would like a much skinnier neck. And it's probably from 1959. So he was already, mature by that time. He really, his real heyday was in the 40s probably, but late 40s. But highly recommend that. That's just something I will throw out there. Okay, so your turn. What's the next fingerstyle album comes to mind you would like to recommend?
Well, it's a pair of people, and I have a two-part answer. I would list Eric Sky and Mark Goldenberg, and at the same time, my mind goes right to Mark's solo effort called Mark Goldenberg, and I really should start there because that album, there's something really unique about it. I'm not entirely sure how much was recorded with acoustic guitars, how much was archtop guitar, and when I say this next statement, I might risk it coming out the wrong way, but that album is as much about the production and the end result of the tones and like the soundscapes he gets. It's one of those albums I wouldn't be surprised if it sounds really, really different if you're lucky enough to see him at a house concert and play it on one guitar without the reverb and the effects. He uses the atmosphere of that recording as much as he uses the actual songs and guitar parts, and it's one of those things I can't separate. I mean, I've never heard that music without hearing that album, but it's an album I cannot separate the guitar playing from the really, really creative, moody use of reverb and a little bit of delay. And it's one of those albums that it's full of so much content I can't understand. Him and his solo album, plus the stuff he does with Eric, it's so jazzy, and it's really a chord vocabulary that goes way above my head. But I would definitely list Mark Goldenberg's 2004 CD called Mark Goldenberg that you can find at his website. And on the same subject, he did a really great duet album with Eric Sky. That album's called Artifact. I was lucky enough to win a signed copy of that from some promotion Eric was doing on either Facebook or the Acoustic Guitar Forum. But it's a collection of really, really, really highbrow. They start playing, and after the 3 or 4 second mark, I don't know what they're doing. It's not necessarily playing weird chords for the sake of being weird, but it's an album I can really sink my teeth into and never, ever expect to be able to play. I know a lot of the music I grew up listening to. I love it so much, the first thing I want to do is learn it. That's not happening here. I won't ever expect to get my chops up to the point where I can hear something from Eric Sky or Mark Goldenberg, let alone together, and try to copy it. But their music together, it's really, really interesting. And I run the risk of sounding cliche a couple of times on this show with this specific episode, but this album, Artifact, there's so many dynamics to it. It seems like they take the approach where, of course, you're playing acoustic music and you want to be quiet, you want to be loud, you want to create some drama. They get so quiet so often. It's such a tease. It almost makes you, maybe not almost, it makes you listen more closely. And their use of phrasing and leaving a lot of space and a lot of volume disparity. It's almost funny. Some amateur recorder might think that they're not playing loud enough in some places, but it really, really draws you in. So my two-part answer there is Eric Sky and Mark Goldenberg together on Artifact, and equally as important, Mark's solo album is just so cool. And if I haven't given you either one of those yet, I really have to turn you on to that stuff.
Actually, I have not heard their collaboration, and I know Goldenberg from seeing him play with Jackson Browne. So that's really quite fascinating. And I think of him more as an all-purpose guitar, but I think of him mainly as a lead guitar. He's the guy that took over basically for Danny Couch and David Lindley, really, in later eras of Jackson Browne's touring life and recording life. So that's very cool.
Let's pause for a moment and listen to a sound sample. This is Eric Sky and Mark Goldenberg.
That reminds me of an album I had not even thought of, but the way you mentioned their collaboration. In the late 90s, Steve Howe and Martin Taylor put a album together, I think called Guitar Masterpieces or Masterpiece Guitars. And what it was Scott Chinnery, the very wealthy New Jersey native that had an enormous and very famous guitar and stringed instrument collection, and also underwrote the Long Island Guitar Show, or whatever it was called at that time. And he unfortunately died quite suddenly, I think, of a heart attack, and ridiculously young. But they had, and he had wanted to do a whole series of albums. The only one that was ever made was Steve Howe and Martin Taylor. And I do know there's one cut on it where one of them is playing a guitar that was made by C.F. Martin Sr., and one of them is playing a guitar made by Orville Gibson. So that was very, very cool. But the whole thing, and I think there's electric and acoustic guitars on the album, if I remember correctly. But really, really cool album. So thank you for those. That's quite interesting. So I'm going to bring up a tandem of guitarists that are related in a certain way as well. And they are Stefan Grossman and Woody Mann, and who unfortunately passed away recently. And these are two guys that have been hugely influential, as much as disciples as themselves, as both of them were proteges of the legendary Reverend Gary Davis in New York City. And you could say that Stefan Grossman is perhaps the prime protege of the Reverend and carrier of that torch. Woody had expanded his music out into more freeform jazz stuff, all kinds of interesting stuff. But as a very young man, he was literally Reverend Gary Davis's guitar carrier. That was his kind of first connection to the Reverend. But anyway, both of them have Martin signature models. The Grossman was a J40 of some sort, a jumbo, and Woody had a very cool signature model that was a mahogany M with a cutaway and a large sound hole and quarter-inch bracing, which I always felt belonged on the M's, and it was really a very cool and one of the most, I think, tone-wise, one of the most successful Martin signature models ever made. But anyway, for them, I would say, if I was just saying for people who are never familiar with them, I'm going to say Heading Uptown is a Woody Mann album, and that's from around the turn of the century. So he even did a tribute album for Gary Davis, Reverend Gary Davis. But I would say then Stairwell Serenade, that was made maybe 10 years later. Those are the two I'd recommend. Woody Mann, unique style. He was always so nice. He had guitar camps in Scotland. I think his wife was from the UK. And he'll be missed. And as for Stefan Grossman, he's still out there. He's still doing his stuff. He's got millions of very worthy guitar learning videos. He got into that very early on. Definitely worth checking out. But in terms of his, I guess, guitar landscape from this century, then he's got all kinds of blues albums. And there was one called, oh boy, this is going back. It's called Love, Devils, and the Blues. That's definitely worth checking out. So he's got many records, but if you're not familiar with Stefan Grossman, if you only know him by name, you should definitely check him out. And the late and lovely Woody Mann.
I sat next to Stefan Grossman at one of the Martin dealer dinners years and years ago at the NAMM show, and I meant to ask him to tell me how to play everything, but he probably would have said, "Get the book." So I just said hi.
Perhaps so. That's very cool. Very cool.
So it's safe to say in this really brief podcast, we probably have talked about all the pertinent fingerstyle players. I'm sure we haven't left anyone off. Would you completely agree that we have not left one stone unturned? I can't think of anybody we didn't talk about already. Could you?
Oh, please. Yes, I could, but I'm only going to pick one. There's so many really cool independent artists out there, fingerstylists, and I'm sure the listeners who are on YouTube will be happy to refer us and other people to their favorites that we have not mentioned. I can't go any farther without mentioning the guitarist that Dick Boak has more than once referred to as the greatest living guitarist. And that's saying a lot because he's known a lot of them. And that's Lawrence Juber.
Maury Rutch. This is really awkward now.
Yeah, it is, because that's not what I was going to say. I was going to say Lawrence Juber.
Ooh.
A lot of people already know this, but Lawrence Juber, right out of music college, became a very successful session musician in London, which quickly led him to being asked by Paul McCartney to join Wings. And he got his first Grammy for his work on the theme to Rockestra, which won the Grammy for Best Rock Instrumental. That may have been the first year it was ever offered, actually, as an award. And after Wings broke up, he wasn't with Wings very long because the band went to Japan. Paul was arrested for possession and decided he wasn't going to tour anymore. And then Wings basically disintegrated after that. And Lawrence moved to New York, became session man again, met his wife, moved to California, and became a lifelong session man in Hollywood on zillions of TV shows and movie soundtracks and whatever. But his first love was always acoustic fingerstyle. And he has got very many records out there. So it would be difficult to pick. And I have to say, I was not familiar with his solo instrumental music at all. I heard maybe 2 cuts on those compilation CDs that some of those labels would put out. And until I bought his signature model, which I bought purely on the merits of its spectacular design as a guitar, which was a Brazilian rosewood, basically a Brazilian rosewood OM-18V with Adirondack spruce and cutaway. And still, I think, one of the great guitars. I've owned 2 of them, regretted selling them. I sold them because of the V-necks that bother my hand now. But anyway, then I met him at NAMM, and he was already familiar with me from my internet presence. And then he became one of the music guests at Martin Fest, and he and his wife and I have been friends ever since. And I try to see him whenever he's on the East Coast. If you haven't seen him, you're really missing something special. I would have to say his LJ Plays the Beatles is a magnificent tour de force. I love his originals a lot, but he's really good at... you mentioned this about Al McMean. He's really good at taking arrangements of famous songs. He's done multiple Beatle albums. He's done Wings albums. He's done other pop music albums. He did a wonderful album called I've Got the World on 6 Strings. That's all music written by Harold Arlen, who wrote If I Only Had a Brain, the music to If I Only Had a Brain, who wrote the music to Stormy Weather, and many other huge American songbook hits as a composer. And so those are the 2 I'm going to bring up right now. I could go on and on about them. I'll say PCH, which stands for Pacific Coast Highway, and the title track from that album. And I think that's also the album that has his absolute barn burner rendition of All of Me. And I highly recommend you find the video of him playing it if you've never seen it. Just spectacular work. And just a master craftsman, but many of his own compositions are about his now what must be heading on 40-year love affair with his wife. And yeah, I can't recommend him enough. And I'll just throw this out here. I was just treated the other day on his Facebook page. He shared a video from the 90s of him and Al Stewart doing a rendition of Time Passages at some like a bookstore or something in Southern California. But it's Al Stewart reveals that it was originally the progression of it is actually an Irish jig. So they start playing this like Irish jig. I think they're actually using flat picks, but and then it goes into Time Passages. But then it becomes this extended Lawrence Juber rock jam. That's just check it out on YouTube. So anyway, you can't have these discussions without Lawrence Juber. I have been happy to see him many times, and I love to watch him perform on there's a great video of him and Tommy Emmanuel, who where Emmanuel just stopped by Lawrence's house and home studio, and they're just like throw around Django Reinhardt stuff and whatever. But anyway, so that's he's always on my playlists. I have relaxation playlists. I have clean the house playlists. I have going out and doing a fitness march in nature playlist, and his music just keeps popping up all over him.
It's funny, you talk about being friends with him and Hope, and I got to meet him, a couple of times at those Martin Fests, and the very first introduction I had with him, I was still running sound at the open mic in the afternoon at the park for Martin Fest, and he was getting ready to do his clinic or his performance, and I thought, I'll play the I know what I'm doing with the sound equipment card, and I'll get like on that level with him, and he'll think I'm a little bit cooler than the person who just walks past and waves. And I said, you got to check this preamp out. And I was putting together some of the gear for the whole afternoon, frankly, not just his set. And I'm plugging him into a Seymour Duncan, a D-Tar. They call it the Solstice. It's a 2-channel preamp. And I'm trying to kind of school him on how cool this thing is. And he's just such a gentleman to just look at me and smile. He said, I helped design that. But it teaches you a lesson, like, just be normal. Don't try to impress everybody. And
but it also proved that you have very good taste in preamps and know your stuff. So.
Well, what a tremendous player. And I know so many musicians, and you probably do too, that have the ego that Lawrence could have, and they don't have his chops. And for how impressive he is, and to get on any stage in Nazareth with Dick Boak famously saying, like you were mentioning a few minutes ago, this guy's the best guitar player. He certainly does not let you think that he thinks and believes that. And he's just a great, great player.
Well, he knows his chops. And by the way, I have to correct myself. PCH is not the album with All of Me. I can't remember which one that is. The reason I was going to mention PCH is he actually has other musicians on it. I'm pretty sure it's Russ Kunkel and Lee Sklar, in fact, as well as some other people. But he does an album with this rhythm section, keyboards, bass, and drums. And then at the end, 3 of the songs are just him doing them solo. So you still get some of his solo fingerstyle guitar. And the end before that, a tune called Blue Guitar Blues, it may mention it on the record, but I know he's talked about it. It was literally like there's 4 minutes left on the clock for the union musicians. So they just do this blues jam with him. I guess he was playing like a blue ES335 or whatever. So it's called Blue Guitars Blues, I think is the name of the song. But not song, these are all instrumentals. But they're very cool and definitely worth checking out.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a big fireworks ending, and I can't fault you for it, but do we have time to maybe do honorable mentions or addendums, or how would you say that?
Sure. By all means, who would you like to throw out there?
Well, don't make a face, and I'm not trying to be cute. You. I really, really mean this. I'm so impressed and attached to your playing style, your recordings. Your Lost and Haunted Ways has made a significant impact on my acoustic, on my ears, on my acoustic life and my ears. You're hardly talked about. I don't know if it was from the early 90s or before that, but I've latched onto it when I met you at NazFest. Fresh Cuts. I don't know if that was a released project or if it was just a bootleg, but your playing, your songwriting, and some of that is where we use the term asterisk here because we're talking about our favorite fingerstyle albums, and Fresh Cuts has lots of singing on it. But I will say, in the scope of this program, I would certainly list Spoon Phillips' Lost and Haunted Ways. I know I yap about it all the time on our YouTube programs, but it's because it really means a lot to me, and I really, really expect that if I turn a friend onto that CD, they're going to really like it. It's not commercial. It's not me pushing the agenda. I really like Lost and Haunted Ways, and I think if I don't mention that on this broadcast for this episode, I'll regret saying it. So I don't mean to make you feel uncomfortable, but I really do count that as one of my faves.
Well, that's very generous of you to say. Thank you very much. Just to correct you, it's actually Select Cuts. And I only bring that up because that was, like you said, it was just a one-off that I basically had made for friends and to bring to Martin Fest. But I am going to recycle that title and probably the album cover itself, which was I don't remember the artist now, but it's like a medieval painting of 2 butchers with parts of cut up boars and cows or whatever. But anyway, I don't know if I'll use that for the select cuts or not album cover. But I'm going to be taking those recordings of the fingerstyle solo stuff, not the songs, and I'm going to have them digitized and modernized, because I probably don't remember how to play that stuff anymore, and then add new cuts to it. So that's probably going to be my next fingerstyle album when I ever get around to and get the funds together and all that. So, but thank you very much.
Well, would you do me a favor? Call that one Fresh Cut so I don't have to edit my episode here.
I'll think about it.
Well, Spoon, speaking of instrumental music, you know what the music means. We're out of time. I want to thank all the great songwriters and musicians who gave birth to that great fingerstyle music that caused us to talk about them all through this episode. We wouldn't be the same musicians we are today without having those soundtracks. And I want to thank you, Spoon, for another great hour-long conversation. From all of us at Maury's Music, thanks for listening.
Hear you later.
This has been a presentation of Maury's Music, your trusted source for Martin and Blue Ridge guitars. Find us online at maurysmusic.com.